This video, we're going to go over how information travels to and from the spinal cord. So I wanted to start out by first going over a few words that you may or may not be familiar with, but I just want everybody on the same page. So the first word is somatic, as in the somatic nervous system, okay? So this is in reference to controlling the skeletal muscle, therefore voluntary control within the body, okay? So that's somatic. The other word is visceral. Visceral nervous system or autonomic nervous system. It's kind of an either or. Both are the same. All right. So this is in reference to controlling smooth and cardiac muscle. So that soft tissue, internal organs, and some glands. Okay. So before we get into showing what information moves through which parts of the spinal cord, I want to just highlight this key that we have up here, okay? So I'm either dealing with motor, somatic, or visceral, which means that the information traveling through that specific part of the spinal cord can either be motor somatic, motor visceral, or it can be motor somatic and motor visceral, okay? Sometimes it is just motor somatic, sometimes it's just motor visceral. Same with sensory though, okay? It can be sensory somatic or sensory visceral or sensory somatic and sensory visceral at the same time, okay? And then we do have something that we'll call mixed nerves, but we'll go over that when we get to it. All right, so we're actually going to start with sensory, all right? Just like in the brain, we got hit with that ball, we are sensing something. So this sensory somatic or sensory visceral information can either come from the anterior ramus or the posterior ramus, okay? It depends on where it's getting picked up from the body. So it's going to travel down that ramus, move through the nerve root, and then up into the posterior root and into the posterior root ganglion, okay? Now, with sensory information, okay, it gets classified. It's not just, yeah, it can be sensory somatic or sensory visceral, but it does have classifications of how it's getting processed. It's like verification steps. So when it gets to the posterior root ganglion, sensory somatic or sensory visceral information becomes first order sensory somatic, sensory visceral, okay? So it's kind of just like a processing station in that posterior root ganglion. It does continue on through the posterior root, and then, of course, it lands into the posterior gray horn, okay? When it hits the posterior gray horn, it becomes second order sensory somatic, sensory visceral, okay? It does then go up into the brain to get processed by the integrative processing. It does become third order sensory somatic or visceral in the thalamus, okay? When it gets processed, we know that sensory information has to then turn into motor information, right? We have to act on that sense. So motor in the brain is classified as upper motor. And in the spinal cord, when it comes back down, it's classified as lower. Okay? Ooh, that doesn't look good. Okay, so let's start with just motor somatic, okay? So motor somatic information can only be picked up by the anterior gray horn, okay? If motor somatic information is processed, sensory somatic information is processed and then it comes back down and it's motor somatic, it can only come through to the gray horn, all right? It will travel through to the anterior root eventually, but it can only be picked up at this location. With motor visceral, it can only be picked up in the spinal cord at the lateral gray horn, okay? And again, it will come into the anterior root eventually. All right. So sensory, somatic, and visceral can be picked up at the same location, but motor, it's split, okay? But when it's traveling through the anterior root, just like with the posterior root, it can be either motor somatic or motor visceral, right? I mean, these two need a place to go. So they are, it is motor somatic and motor visceral as it moves through the anterior root, through the spinal nerve, and then through the anterior ramus or up through the posterior ramus, depending on where the information needs to go. Okay. So when we have purple and yellow lines, right, we have the option to have both motor somatic and motor visceral, sensory somatic and sensory visceral. All of those signals can be in the same locations at the same time. We call it mixed nerves. Okay. So that spinal nerve and these two rami, these are all mixed nerves where it can either be sensory or motor, somatic, or visceral information traveling. All right. So lastly, we need to talk about the rami communicants. So these are pretty special. Only motor visceral can travel through the rami communicants. All right. There's no way that motor somatic could come through here. There's no way that sensory information could come through here. It's only motor visceral. All right.